The officer listened to Elena's father, the way a magistrate listens to a petition he cannot grant. He didn't shout, didn't brandish a weapon, didn't even shift his stance. He simply held the scroll open in his hands and explained, with a practiced calm, that the decision had already been approved by officials far beyond this village. Her name had been written down long before he arrived, and nothing said here would change it. The villagers had seen raids before, and this didn't resemble one. The soldiers weren't here to punish anyone, nor were they searching homes or dragging people into the open. The collection was orderly, almost administrative, as though the officer were fulfilling a responsibility rather than enforcing a threat. Elena realized, even through her fear, that the process was not driven by anger or opportunity. It followed a plan. A few families tried offering money or livestock in exchange for their daughters. The officer declined without hostility, simply noting that the matter was not negotiable. Others asked why the girls had been chosen in the first place, but the soldiers provided no explanation. It became painfully clear that this wasn't chance. These names had been selected by someone they would never meet, for reasons no one in the village understood. And here's where most misconceptions about Ottoman levies begin. The devşirme that people know, the levy for boys who later became janissaries, was public, structured, and widely documented. What was happening now followed a far quieter set of rules. These girls were not being taken to train for war, nor were they being held as hostages or traded for ransom. They were being drawn into an imperial system that operated behind palace walls, a system that left almost no trace in official chronicles. Elena didn't understand any of that yet. She only knew that the world she recognized was slipping away from her with every step toward the waiting horses. Her village stood frozen in stunned silence, not because they didn't care, but because they realized they were powerless to intervene. By the time she was led out of the square, what frightened her most wasn't the soldiers or their weapons. It was the certainty that her fate had been decided long before she woke that morning. The Ottoman Empire never expanded only through armies. Its rulers understood that controlling a city's soldiers was far easier than controlling the politics inside their own palace walls. By the mid-15th century, Mehmed II had reshaped the state into an engine of absolute power. But even absolute power had vulnerabilities hidden behind silk curtains and carved wooden screens. The imperial household had always relied on women for far more than romanticized stories suggest. They were caretakers, educators, cultural intermediaries, stewards of the sultan's private chambers, and the people who raised the heirs long before they stepped onto a battlefield. Yet this inner world was notoriously unstable. Freeborn Muslim women came with families, loyalties, and connections that extended beyond the palace. Their presence could strengthen one faction and weaken another. And in an era when a whisper could topple a vizier, those external loyalties were a threat no sultan could afford to ignore. Throughout the 14th and early 15th centuries, palace intrigues had become dangerous enough to capture the attention of foreign ambassadors. A favorite concubine could champion one son over another. A mother-in-law from a powerful Anatolian clan might rally relatives to influence appointments. Rumors of poisonings circulated through Ottoman and Venetian records alike. The harem, despite its serene appearance, was a political landscape as volatile as any battlefield. Mehmed II confronted this instability directly after conquering Constantinople in 1453. His empire was expanding rapidly, and he needed a household that served only him, not external interests, not tribal alliances, not inherited debts. So the palace turned toward a solution it had used in smaller forms before, but never with such coordination: recruiting girls from conquered Christian regions to serve in the imperial household. In many provinces, this practice wasn't presented openly as seizure. It was framed as an imperial obligation, a human levy, a silent tribute paid in daughters instead of coin, taken from Christian families who had no power to refuse. Unlike freeborn Muslim women, these girls came from families with no influence in the Ottoman hierarchy. Once inside the palace, they had no relatives to advocate for them, no local networks to empower them, and no prior allegiances that could complicate their roles. After conversion, they would belong entirely to the Sultan's world. The process was never labeled clearly in legal codes, which is why many textbooks skip over it. But the pattern appears in scattered records, in tax registers listing foreign girls assigned to service, in household budgets that included funds for their training, and in complaints filed by Balkan communities after losing daughters to imperial officials. For Mehmed, this was not cruelty. It was logistics. A stable empire required a stable palace, and a stable palace required women whose loyalty could not be divided. From the Ottoman perspective, this was statecraft. From the perspective of the families who watched their daughters taken, it was something far harder to rationalize. By the time Elena and the others were collected, this quiet system had already been operating for years. Villages knew to fear the appearance of soldiers who carried lists rather than swords. Mothers whispered stories about girls who never returned. Priests encouraged families to move deeper into the mountains if word spread that an imperial survey was underway. Most didn't make it in time. This is the part of Ottoman history that rarely reaches the classroom. Not because it is sensational, but because it operates in the awkward space between documented policy and lived experience, a system historians piece together from broken lines in ledgers, petitions from frightened parents, and the palace's own careful silence. For the empire, these girls represented order. For their families, they represented loss. For Elena, though she didn't yet understand it, they represented the beginning of a transformation designed to sever her from everything she once was. And from here, the road would only take her deeper into the machinery that shaped the Sultan's world. The road to Constantinople stretched for days, and the further the girls traveled, the clearer it became that this journey followed a routine established long before they were born. Soldiers did not treat them harshly, but there was an unmistakable structure to everything: how they were transported, how they were grouped, even when they were allowed to speak. It was the discipline of an operation that had been refined through repetition. Elena noticed that the soldiers rarely addressed the girls directly. Instead, they observed them with a quiet, evaluative focus, as though already assessing where each might fit in a system none of them had been taught to imagine. Older girls tended to be placed near the front, younger ones toward the back. Those with striking features or confident posture received particular attention. There was no explanation offered, no written criteria they could see, but the pattern was unmistakable. When they reached the outskirts of Constantinople, the atmosphere shifted. The soldiers handed them over to palace officials, women dressed in layered silks and guarded expressions, accompanied by eunuchs who carried ledgers and wooden tokens inscribed with numbers. These women were not sentimental caretakers, they were administrators. Their job was to classify the new arrivals before the palace absorbed them completely. The classification began in a courtyard enclosed by tall stone walls. The girls were asked to stand in rows while the officials walked through them, with the same detached scrutiny one might use in selecting performers or apprentices. They examined posture, clarity of skin, quality of hair, strength of limbs. They listened to voices. They asked the girls to walk. A few were instructed to demonstrate familiarity with basic household tasks. Others were tested on reading or singing. None of these activities were explained. Every girl was then assigned a wooden token with a number carved on one side and an Ottoman letter on the other. Names meant nothing here. The tokens determined their initial placement within the palace. Service wings, training halls, or rarely units reserved for girls considered to have exceptional potential. The renaming came next. It was handled with calm certainty, not cruelty, and that made it feel even more absolute. A woman read a list of new Muslim names and directed each girl to acknowledge the one assigned to her. On the palace records, Elena would no longer be listed as the daughter of Marcos from Epirus, but under a name chosen for her by strangers. She heard it, understood it, and kept her real name inside her mind. For the palace, she was now someone else. For our story, she remains Elena. The loss didn't come all at once. It accumulated in pieces. First the name, then the language. Greek, Albanian, Serbian, Bulgarian. Each was discouraged with increasing severity. The palace enforced Turkish as a requirement, not a preference, and matron supervisors monitored conversations with quiet vigilance. The penalty for repeated violation was isolation in a small, windowless chamber designed more to unsettle than punish. Girls who spent time there often emerged subdued, speaking softly, careful about how they carried themselves. Conversion was handled with similar efficiency. There was no dramatic ceremony, no forced display of devotion. Instead, palace imams introduced the girls to basic prayers and instructed them in the expectations of their new faith. Acceptance was assumed, resistance was noted in ledgers that none of the girls were permitted to see. Over time, these notes determined everything: training paths, living arrangements, privileges and punishments. The early training, referred to within palace walls as the quieting period, lasted several months. Girls learned not only practical skills, music, manners, literacy, dance, textile work, but also the subtler expectations of palace life. They were taught how to hold their gaze, how to move through rooms with controlled elegance, and how to practice silence when silence was required. The lessons were never announced as rules, yet breaking them resulted in swift correction. The most unsettling part of this period was how little was spoken aloud. Instructions were delivered softly, almost gently, but the consequences of failure were made visible through example. A girl who arrived the same day as Elena was reassigned to the laundry hall after refusing to abandon her birth name. Another was moved to a remote workroom after speaking in her native language. Rumors circulated that these reassigned girls were unlikely to progress, though no one confirmed or denied it. The palace did not need to act brutally to establish control. It relied on the quiet erosion of certainty, on rituals that replaced a girl's sense of self, with roles defined entirely by the institution. Eunuchs enforced the rules without emotion. Senior palace women shaped the recruits with the precision of artisans. Officials kept records in neat columns that reduced each girl to potential. By the end of the quieting period, the girls rarely spoke of their pasts. Some avoided mentioning their families altogether. Others carried memories silently, unsure whether remembering them was a comfort or a threat. Elena began to realize that survival in this place came from adapting quickly and drawing as little negative attention as possible. Yet beneath the discipline and order, there was an undercurrent none of the girls could name. They sensed it in the way officials observed them, in the way instructors positioned them during training, and in the way certain girls were pulled aside for additional evaluation behind closed doors. These moments were never explained. They left behind a quiet fear, a sense that some futures inside the palace carried immense privilege, while others demanded sacrifices no one dared describe aloud. This was the beginning of their transformation, not through violence, but through the systematic unmaking of the identities they brought with them. The palace had no interest in who they had been. It cared only about who they could become. And for Elena, the path ahead would take her deeper into a world designed to reshape her in ways she could not yet understand. If you pause the story here, it almost looks like discipline and education. But it wasn't. It was shaping the kind designed not to elevate a girl, but to erase the one she used to be. By the time Elena completed her early training, she had learned something essential about the palace. Nothing in its design was accidental. Every corridor, every screen, every silence existed for a reason. The harem was not a romantic sanctuary imagined in foreign stories. It was a meticulously organized institution where thousands of women and servants operated within a hierarchy more complex than the military outside its walls. Elena entered this world as part of a cohort assigned to the Ostahane, a training division overseen by senior palace women. These women had been in service for decades. Some had risen to extraordinary influence, acting as advisors to the Sultan's mother, or managing the flow of information between the inner chambers and the administrative court. Their authority was quiet but absolute. When they walked through the halls, even the eunuchs stepped aside. The girls were divided into categories based on assessments conducted during the quieting period. The criteria were never openly stated, yet everyone understood their weight. Some girls were assigned to domestic work, needlecraft, cleaning, textile production, laundry. Others were selected for roles closer to the imperial family, preparing the sultan's chambers, assisting elite concubines, maintaining ceremonial garments. A smaller group, often those considered exceptionally graceful or intelligent, received specialized training for duties that placed them near the sultan himself. Elena quickly grasped why the officials had watched them so closely upon arrival. The palace did not treat its women as individuals. It treated them as resources to be shaped, classified, and deployed with precision. The hidden perversion of the system was not in overt cruelty, but in how thoroughly it transformed human beings into functions. During afternoon lessons, the girls practiced walking with measured steps along narrow wooden beams. The exercise was explained as posture training, but everyone understood it served other purposes: balance, grace, presence. They learned music, not merely for entertainment, but because performance reflected refinement. They practiced the art of listening more than speaking, an essential skill for a world where information flowed through whispers and gestures rather than declarations. Occasionally, eunuchs would escort senior officials through the training halls. These visits were brief, unannounced, and always silent. The officials examined the girls with attentive deliberation, as though searching for something very particular: confidence without arrogance, beauty without defiance, obedience without fragility. Their evaluations determined which girls advanced and which remained where they were. Certain assignments had implications the girls discussed only in private. Being chosen to serve as an attendant to a favored concubine meant proximity to the sultan's personal world, a place of both opportunity and danger. Girls selected for the sultan's broader household learned skills related to ceremony and etiquette, an education that hinted gently but unmistakably at the possibility of more intimate roles in the future. No one explained these implications aloud, yet every girl understood the weight behind the selection. Elena noticed that the palace maintained a delicate balance of affection and fear. Instructor matrons spoke kindly during lessons, but corrected violations with unsettling precision. Eunuchs enforced rules without visible anger. Their neutrality made them more intimidating. The older palace women, those who had survived decades within this system, rarely spoke of their early years. Their silence conveyed everything the girls needed to know. Advancement in the palace came not from ambition, but from the ability to understand unspoken expectations. The most carefully guarded area of the harem was the privy chamber, the complex of rooms closest to the sultan. Only a small number of women ever entered it, and they did so under strict supervision. Rumors circulated about what occurred within those chambers, but they were fragments, stories from dismissed servants, whispers overheard through screens, entries found in foreign ambassadors' journals. The palace itself revealed very little. Girls assigned to training for these roles were given separate lessons at night. They were taught controlled poise, subtle choreography, and the etiquette of presenting objects to the sultan without ever initiating touch. These lessons were framed as preparation for ceremonial duties, but the undertone was unmistakable. Their bodies, voices, and gestures were being shaped for settings where the slightest misstep carried consequences. Elena noticed other patterns as well. The palace kept detailed records of each girl, her behavior, progress, trustworthiness. Some girls were periodically evaluated in private rooms by senior matrons, who recorded their notes with remarkable consistency. The system cared deeply about predictability. A girl who reacted unpredictably, who showed signs of resistance or unpredictable emotion, was often reassigned to less visible positions. Despite the quiet severity of the palace, there were moments of fascination that made the girls forget the cost of their transformation. The architecture was breathtaking. Gardens filled with fountains and cypress trees offered glimpses of a life that felt almost unreal. The ceremonial halls shimmered with painted ceilings and intricate tiles. For a time, Elena felt suspended between fear and awe, drifting through a world designed to impress even as it reshaped her without permission. Yet beneath all of this beauty, she could sense the structure guiding her life, narrowing into something she had not chosen. Choices diminished with each passing month. Paths were decided without consultation. And though she excelled in her lessons, her progress felt less like advancement and more like surrender. The palace had not harmed her physically. It didn't need to. It simply replaced her old identity with a role so carefully constructed that eventually she would forget who she had been before the scroll bore her name. Elena had entered the palace as a daughter of Eprius. She now lived as a recruit in a world that intended to rewrite her completely. But some girls did not accept this transformation quietly, an act of defiance the palace never tolerated. And one such girl's story would travel farther than the palace intended. Meryl had always carried herself with a confidence that drew attention the moment she entered a room. The palace valued girls like her, poised, disciplined, naturally graceful. These qualities weren't simply admired. They were assessed, measured, and quietly recorded in ledgers the girls never saw. Meryl's name appeared often in those assessments. Everyone knew what that meant. She was being prepared for the Sultan's private household. The instructors never said this directly, but the implication lived in the spaces between their lessons. The way they corrected Meryl's posture, the way they guided her hands, the way they monitored her reactions when a senior official stepped close enough to test her composure. It all pointed in one direction. Service near the Sultan demanded a level of refinement that went beyond etiquette. It required a shaping of the self, a quiet compliance, a willingness to follow unspoken expectations. And this was where Meryl differed from the others. She obeyed instructions, but there was a controlled distance in her expression, a sense that she performed each task without surrendering the part of herself the palace wanted most, her inner submission. The instructors noticed. The palace always noticed. One evening, after a lesson on ceremonial greeting, a senior eunuch entered the hall and called Meryl's name. His tone was polite, almost gentle. Still, every girl recognized what it meant when a eunuch came personally. She was being taken to the selection chamber. The chamber was not a room the younger recruits ever saw. It existed somewhere deeper within the harem complex, past a series of screens and narrow corridors. It was where final evaluations were conducted for girls considered suitable for roles that brought them into the Sultan's proximity. No announcements were made about who entered the chamber or what transpired inside it. The palace never used threats. It didn't need to. Silence was its strongest language. Meryl walked with the eunuch at dusk. Elena caught a glimpse of her before she disappeared behind the wooden screens, her expression calm, but her shoulders drawn slightly inward, as though bracing herself for something she could not avoid. That image stayed with Elena long after the lamps were extinguished that night. Meryl did not return by morning. The instructors began the day's rotations without acknowledging her absence. This, too, was part of the design. The palace rarely paused for the fate of a single girl. Lessons continued, measured and controlled, while the girls tried to steady their breathing and follow instructions that now felt heavier than before. Whispers started before nightfall. A kitchen attendant claimed she saw 2 eunuchs carrying a basin stained with diluted red. Another girl said she heard the muffled sound of someone speaking harshly behind the selection chamber doors. A third insisted that Meryl had failed a crucial obedience test, perhaps a hesitation, a moment of uncertainty, a reaction the palace deemed inappropriate for someone destined to serve close to power. By the second night, unease spread through the dormitories. Some girls prayed quietly. Others lay awake, staring at the ceiling, their minds trying to fill the silence with explanations that felt safe, even when they knew the truth was not. On the third day, the palace delivered the answer without ever speaking it. During afternoon training, a group of matrons entered the hall. They did not look at the girls. They walked straight to Meryl's storage chest, opened it with steady hands, and began removing her possessions. Her carefully folded garments, her learning tablets, the beaded string she used to steady her breath during difficult lessons. Everything was placed into a plain cloth sack. The girls stopped moving, caught between instinct and fear. The matrons tied the sack, lifted it and left, never once acknowledging the frozen expressions around them. Later that day, a new roster was posted on the training hall door. Elena searched for Meryl's name slowly, reading each line twice to be sure. It wasn't there. It wasn't crossed out or reassigned. It had simply been erased. This was the palace's final judgment. A girl chosen for advancement was not permitted to fail. A hesitation in discipline, a flicker of self that the palace could not reshape, was not an inconvenience. It was a threat to a system built on flawless control. So the palace removed her from the future entirely. Some whispered that Meryl had resisted a command inside the selection chamber. Others believed she had been unable to maintain the required composure. A few suggested she had been reassigned to a remote palace, though they said it in tones that revealed they didn't believe it. In the Ottoman household, reassignment was written down. Erasure never was. That night, Elena lay awake, unable to push away the realization that had been building since the day she arrived. The training, the poise, the lessons, the insistence on silence, they were not refinements, they were preparation. Not for ordinary service at court, not for ceremony, but for a role that demanded access to the most private part of imperial life, where the sultan's will dictated everything, and a girl's obedience had to be absolute. Meryl's disappearance revealed what the palace never said aloud. A girl's greatest value here was not her skill, it was her compliance. And anyone who resisted, even quietly, even gracefully, was removed without leaving a shadow behind. Elena understood then that the palace hadn't simply taken her from her village, it had taken her future and placed it on a path where survival depended on giving up far more than her name. Years later, when Elena looked back on her first months in the palace, she realized that it had not been the loss of her home, or even the loss of her name that changed her most. It was the moment when Meryl vanished without a trace, when the palace reminded every girl inside its walls that obedience was not simply expected, but essential to survival. After Meryl's erasure, the atmosphere within the training halls shifted. Instructions were followed more quickly, voices grew softer, movements became more deliberate. The girls learned, almost unconsciously, to conceal their thoughts behind expressions that revealed nothing. They adapted to the palace the way a flame adapts to wind, flickering inward, tightening on itself to avoid being extinguished. Elena excelled in her lessons, not because she desired advancement, but because she understood the cost of standing out in the wrong way. She learned to anticipate commands before they were spoken, to soften her tone when addressed by instructors, to read the smallest cues in the faces of the matrons who evaluated them. Each skill brought her deeper into the palace's design, even as it carried her farther from the person she had been before the soldiers came with their list. Over time, she realized there was a strange duality to the palace. On the surface, it was a place of extraordinary beauty. Gardens, fountains, shimmering tiles, songs drifting through the air during evening prayers. But beneath that beauty lay the machinery that governed every life within its walls. A machinery sustained not by overt brutality, but by the careful shaping of identity, the quiet removal of those who resisted, and the immense power of a system that left no trace of those it chose to forget. Elena watched new girls arrive year after year, some frightened, some naive, some hopeful that their lives might improve inside the palace. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same mixture of uncertainty and disbelief she had carried when she first crossed the harem threshold. She wanted to warn them, but warnings had no place here. The palace taught through observation, not words. Of Meryl, nothing was ever spoken officially. Her name never appeared in any records Elena later saw. No servant whispered her story to newcomers. Her belongings were redistributed, her sleeping space reassigned, her absence absorbed by the rhythm of palace life. That was the ultimate power of the institution. It did not need to hide what happened. It simply made the memory unnecessary. And yet, Elena remembered, not because she wished to dwell on loss, but because Meryl's disappearance revealed a truth she could never allow herself to forget. That power is at its most dangerous when it operates in silence, shaping lives behind closed doors and recording only what it wishes the world to know. Long after Elena's own path carried her into different roles within the palace, she kept one memory untouched: the sight of Meryl walking toward the selection chamber with steady steps, unaware that history would never record her name. That memory remained a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let the palace erase what it dared not remember. History rarely preserves the lives of girls like Elena or Meryl. The ledgers of empires focus on sultans, viziers, treaties, and conquests. But behind every one of those public victories stood a private world built on the quiet obedience of those who had no voice. Their stories were not written in chronicles. They survived only in the shadows cast by the institutions that consumed them. If Elena's story teaches anything, it is that the greatest tragedies in history are not always marked by battles or decrees. Sometimes they unfold in rooms with closed doors, in the silence after a name disappears from a roster, in the spaces where power reshapes a life until the person beneath it becomes almost unrecognizable. And yet something endured. Not rebellion, not escape, but memory. Because even in a palace designed to erase the past, one girl remembering another was enough to preserve a truth the empire never intended the world to see.